All right, today's video is going to start with topic 8.3, the Red Scare. And just as a Red Scare had followed our victory in World War I, there is some continuity here 30 years later. After World War II, we have a second Red Scare, and sometimes it's going to be the second Red Scare on the AP test. Other times it will simply be the Red Scare. Ultimately, this is at the domestic side of things that President Truman and the United States Congress had to deal with. Part of this fear is the tendency to see red everywhere, right? To see a communist conspiracy everywhere, at home, but also abroad. The various civil wars that would break out in Europe and Asia held that communist conspirators taking their orders from Moscow were calling the shots. And here at home, that American society itself had been infiltrated by spies, and that some of these spies were even in the State Department or perhaps even in the military itself. So how real was the threat? And that's something that as historians and scholars we have to go back and look at. Was this truly just hysteria? Was there some truth to it? Was it totally overblown? And these are things that historians are still sorting out. But ultimately, the Truman administration really had to look at, the bigger picture of, could we maintain civil liberties? Could we maintain freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and all those great things that are housed in the First Amendment and our Constitution? The tolerance for dissent, right? The ability to speak your mind without fear of reproach. And can we do this up against, totalitarian dictatorships, especially Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, someone who was unbelievably ruthless, and was the containment of communism something that had to be done here as well as abroad. And so these are things that were playing out these early years following World War II. And 1949 really is a crucial year, and so many things were happening. The big shock, of course, was China going red, right? We have the largest populated country in the world now under total communist control. And Mao traveling to Moscow and being there for 2 months and meeting with Stalin, like all our worst fears were coming true here, that this would be truly a monolith, a red monolith that could threaten free people, just not in Europe, but also now threaten people in Asia as well. And right along with that is the Soviet Union detonating their first atomic bomb. And with that gone is our military monopoly. And that was a really powerful thing the United States had when we only had the atomic bomb. And now our enemies have that as well. So the fact that our people here are as threatened by nuclear warfare. And then also in 1949 and in 1950, two high-profile cases, one in the United States with Alger Hiss, and one in Great Britain with a former German immigrant, Klaus Fuchs, who was convicted and confessed to sharing and stealing nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union. And the Alger Hiss case was national testimony, and this really brought to the forefront Richard Nixon, who was a congressman from California. Now, Hiss had been a prominent official in the State Department. He was even with Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference. So this is a high-level person who was accused of being a member of the Communist Party and an informant for the Soviet Union, which he totally denied. that he had given any secret documents to Whittaker Chambers, who then passed it on to the Soviet Union. He was later convicted of perjury, lying under oath, and was sentenced to prison. Well, if someone like Hiss was actively working for our enemy, how many other Hisses were there in the United States? So that was shocking as well. And then, of course, in June of 1950, North Korea, with the backing of Joseph Stalin, invades South Korea. So we have spies and traitors and these weapons of mass destruction and now sneak attacks that are taking place. And this is creating all part of this hysteria. Now, one of the key terms that you will more than likely see would be HUAC, HUAC, and this is the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was originally established in 1939 to hunt down fascists in the United States, and is later brought out of retirement, if you will, to find communists in the post-war years. Now, this committee was looking for subversion, and subversion is another key term that you might see. People who are subverting, trying to destroy the traditional or normal way of life in society. And many people, over a course of a number of years, were brought up to testify of what they knew about communist conspiracy, communist infiltration, spies, etc., in the House of Representatives. Are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Which was a standard question there. And the committee not only investigated government officials, but looked into any type of communist influence, especially in Hollywood and the film industry, with mass media becoming so predominant in America following World War II. So writers and directors and actors, and even actors who were the president of the Screen Actors Guild. We see up here in the right-hand corner, Ronald Reagan. Much more on him later. Were called to the committee to testify. And those who refused to testify were tried for contempt of Congress. And others were blacklisted. And we'll talk about a couple of them in a minute. So we have the Loyalty Review Program, and this was set up by the Truman administration under pressure from Congress to investigate the background of millions of federal employees and civil servants. And they had to take a loyalty oath to the United States and to the Constitution, and they had to resign or lose their jobs if they did not do so. So another example you could use to support the causes and really the effects of the Red Scare. Okay, and then we have some laws that could pop up. We have the Smith Act. Again, was an act passed pre-entry into World War II in 1940, and it pretty much made illegal for any U.S. citizen to advocate or teach the overthrow of the government, of the Constitution, by force or into any other means, or to even belong to an organization where the overthrow of the government was the objective. Later in 1951, this came up to the Supreme Court, Dennis et al. V. United States, and the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Smith Act. And then in 1950, we have the McCarran Act, or the McCarran Internal Security Act, which was passed by Congress over Truman's veto, which, one, made it unlawful to support or advocate the establishment of any totalitarian government. Number two, it restricted the employment and travel of those joining any communist organization or a communist front organization, something that gave support to communism. And three, authorized, though never implemented, the creation of detention camps for subversives with that. Okay, and tied back to this is a lot of men and women in the 1930s, especially in Hollywood, had joined or at least gone to Communist Party meetings. It was the Great Depression. Again, people's faith in capitalism, democracy had been shaken. And this became just a thing that people had done in Hollywood. Now, some were members of the Communist Party. Most just went to these meetings. When they're brought up in front of HUAC, some of them are not going to testify. And the Hollywood 10 is just the name given to 10 Hollywood writers who refused to testify and name names, right? They refused to name names. Who else did they know that was in the Communist Party? And they and others in Hollywood at different times were blacklisted from the industry, right? These lists of their names were distributed amongst the major Hollywood studios, and they could not find any type of work in the movie industry. At this time, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was growing in reach and sophistication under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover. And since this was a domestic part of the executive branch, the CIA is going to be international foreign policy, the FBI is domestic. And though they had hunted down gangsters and bootleggers during Prohibition, FBI under Hoover really gained strength as seeking out any subversives, but especially communists in the United States. And lastly, there was the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg of New York, who were accused of spying and giving nuclear secrets to the Soviets. After a controversial trial in 1951, the Rosenbergs were found guilty of treason and executed by the electric chair in 1953. Civil rights groups, like they had done in the 1920s with the Sacco and Vanzetti murder trial, charged that they had not been given a fair trial. And here the Rosenbergs were charged because of the anti-communist hysteria, and that the Red Scare itself was responsible for the conviction and punishment of the Rosenbergs. Now, years later, after the Cold War ended, a number of CIA and FBI files were declassified under Project Verona, and Soviet archives were opened up as well following the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. And it did give much more clear evidence that Alger Hiss and at least Julius Rosenberg were in the employment and loyal to the Soviet Union and not to the United States with that. So with the Red Scare, the centerpiece and probably what would appear the most would be this man, Joseph McCarthy. And the phrase McCarthyism is a phrase and a word that has now traveled beyond its time period into our modern world. And Joe McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin, a junior senator, so he was new. And in 1950, he made the shocking claim, the shocking charge, that over 200 people in the State Department were in fact communists. And this was a sensational accusation that really caught fire in the American press. And really nobody rode the wave of anti-communist hysteria like Senator McCarthy, Tail Gunner Joe, as his campaign nickname was, veteran of World War II, which most politicians in the post-war world were. And for the next 4 years, he wielded tremendous power in his position as a senator. Fear, suspicion, accusations. He really had a steady stream in the media, kept the media focused on himself and communist conspiracies. He also had a populist tinge to him. Many of the people he was accusing of being communists tended to be wealthy and the privileged in society. Some like, Alger Hiss, all the best schools and connected to ideas of the liberal consensus that we'll get to in a future video with that. And this power continued in the Truman administration into the Eisenhower administration. And as Republicans, at least in the executive, took power back, McCarthy, as a Republican, had power of fear that even initially Eisenhower himself just hoped that McCarthy would go away, burn himself out in one way or another. Were there communist spies and subversives in the United States? Yes, there were. And so this is the tricky business of McCarthy and why he's still controversial today. He was making known to the public that there was this true fear, but how he did it, how he went about doing that, often with lack of evidence, his fierce accusations and fear-mongering did more harm than good ultimately with this. Now, his downfall came in 1954 when he started to go after the army, that there were communists actually embedded in high ranks of the United States military. They had infiltrated the army. And this is the power of television, which we're going to talk about a whole lot down the road, the power of TV and how there were hearings, the Army McCarthy hearings, as they're known. And here, McCarthy in action was shocking to even some of his supporters or lukewarm supporters, that he was seen as a bully. And the challenge and pushback against him really did begin. And eventually, even the Republicans joined Democrats to censor McCarthy in the Senate. And so the witch hunt for communists and seeing communists everywhere, seeing Reds everywhere, started to play itself out. It would never totally go away, but the height and hysteria of the Red Scare is tempered, is pulled back in 1954. It did help that in 1953, Joseph Stalin finally died. And so there was a sense of a deep breath coming out of this post-war atmosphere. We want to look at how the Red Scare played out in media, in novels, and things like this. And in 1949, George Orwell, the British writer, published his book 1984, which has become a literary classic for many reasons. Now, not exactly a part of the Red Scare necessarily, but at least in the United States, but Orwell's book gathered power over time. And what Orwell was trying to go with, and this book is very layered, is the threat of Stalinism, right? The threat of totalitarian systems, and how everyday people can get caught up in it and even destroyed by it. And with it, the destruction of freedom of speech, the destruction of thinking, and to challenge authority and to challenge totalitarian propaganda. So that comes out in 1949, right in the middle of this Red Scare. And then a few years later, right before the Army McCarthy hearings, we have on Broadway the play, The Crucible, by Arthur Miller. And here, this is an allegory for McCarthyism. And he takes it, set it in the Salem witch trials. So it goes back to Puritan times. And the hysteria, the conformity, the fear, the guilt by accusation, the guilt by association, all played out in the play. And really the danger of ideology, the danger of tribalism, right? That all or nothing, you're with us or you're against us. And the fact that individual is in a dangerous place. And the integrity of an individual to stand up against such accusations. And finally, along with this, just how anti-red, anti-communist ideas permeated both high culture in terms of 1984 and The Crucible, and just popular culture with tons of movies and allegories like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Red Menace, and all kinds of other ones that were going on at the time.